I'm Susie Cunningham. I'm the director of the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. And I want to talk to you about something I've been working on for the last 15 years, which is the impacts of climate change on birds, particularly with respect to behaviour and how behaviour modifies and shapes the impacts of climate change. I have a bit of a slow connection here, so I'm just going to turn my video off and hopefully we'll not have any trouble with that. Okay. All right, so the Hotbirds Research Project team is the team that I have been working with for the past decade and a half. We are an international collaboration of avian behavioural ecologists and ecophysiologists, and we're led from the University of Cape Town and the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology, and also from the University of Pretoria, where my close colleague Andrew McKechnie works. So I head up the behavioural ecology part of this program, and Andrew heads up our ecophysiology team. And together we have a large network of collaborators at institutes all over the world, shown on the slide here. And we've been working on questions surrounding the impacts of climate change on birds since 2009. So here are some of our team members and students. This isn't everyone, just a large number of the group that we've been working with over this time. All wonderful people who I'm delighted to have been able to work with. So for the past 15 years, we've been working on birds in deserts mostly, although we do increasingly work on alpine species as well, and also on birds in mesic habitats in addition. But mostly, or at least to begin with, we focused on the hot deserts of Southern Africa, of outback Australia, and of the Southwest USA. And it's only in the recent decade or so, I guess, especially the last 5 years, that we've started working in mesic environments and in urban environments as well. Our aim has been to understand the mechanisms that underlie the vulnerability and resilience of birds to climate change. That is, to try to get a handle on what it is about birds' physiology and behavior that links them to the climate envelopes that they occupy, and how that might influence how they respond to the change in those climate envelopes through time. And we began our work in deserts deliberately because arid zones are already really extreme places to live, and many desert organisms exist at their tolerance limits already. So deserts, therefore, might help us understand what life can cope with at the hot end, which is really important, both in terms of our fundamental understanding of behaviour and ecophysiology, and also for our ability to do conservation in a warming world. And desert areas are warming really rapidly. So among the fastest places in the world, in fact, for warming rates, here in the southern part of Africa, our desert areas have already warmed by 3 degrees. That's twice the global average since climate warming records began. So we see these warming trends ubiquitously across the planet. Here's some weather stations from North America. This is Yuma, Arizona. Here in outback Australia, Curtin Springs and Birdsville in Queensland. These graphs show us the number of days per year that exceed 40 degrees Celsius on the y-axis and the year on the x-axis. And here are a couple of weather stations from Southern Africa showing this consistent upward trend in the numbers of hot days annually. Here are 2 southern Kalahari weather stations, 200 kilometers apart from the core of our research study area from 1960 to 2020, showing the mean summer maximum daily air temperature. And we see this real acceleration of climate warming, especially in southern Africa, since the mid-1990s. Okay. So the original aim of the behavioural ecology branch of the Hotbirds Research Programme, which is the part of the programme that I lead, was to understand this. Can desert birds' behaviour tell us something useful about their vulnerability to climate change? So 16 years later, and about 60 papers later, we've developed and expanded this theme, and we can now describe the work we're doing and building towards under a series of interlinked applied, which I've put in blue, and theoretical, which I've put in orange, questions that go something like this. So how can behaviour buffer or exacerbate climate risk? And what are the factors that mediate the costs of behavioural responses to environmental change? So things like ecological and social factors. Can we use behaviour data to design conservation interventions? And what is the relationship between thermal biology and ecosystem function? So what I'll try to do for each of these themes is pull together a bit of a summary of the parts that we've learned so far, and also to talk about some of the challenges and the unanswered questions that we're still grappling with. So the framework that we've been using to think about these questions for the past decade and a half looks something like this. So we expect that rising temperatures will influence the behavior of physiology of birds directly, but also via the interaction between those two, between behavior and physiology. And so these in turn are affecting proxies of fitness, which are survival and reproduction, with implications for population persistence and also for evolutionary selective pressure, which is another whole story that we don't have time for today. So changes in population persistence themselves could obviously affect ecosystem function by changes in the relative abundance of organisms. But there's another possibility that I'll get to towards the end of the talk, and that's this idea that changes in behavior by themselves could affect ecosystems. So this is something that's currently largely overlooked in the literature, but which I think could be really important. So we'll come back to it towards the end of the talk. But before I move on, I also want to point out that I'm going to be focusing on temperature throughout this talk, and we do generally focus on temperature in our research group to a large extent, but not exclusively. We're looking more and more at humidity now. But temperature, we've been focusing on it because it's the component of climate change that we're best able to predict right now. Our models are much better at predicting temperature change than they are predicting precipitation change, for example. But of course, it's only one aspect of climate change, and there are other things going on as well. Okay, so the major applied theme for the behavioral ecology part of the project has been this one. How might behavior buffer or exacerbate climate risk, and what might mediate this? So to get a handle on this, we first need to understand how and why temperature affects animal behavior and what this means for the hypotheses that we can build and the patterns that we might expect to see. So to do this as well as we can, we first need to know the basics of thermal physiology and what this means for how animals use thermal landscapes or landscapes of heat. And we need to consider what the outcomes of those behavioral changes for thermoregulation can be for individuals. So for example, we might think about the balance of behavioral costs and benefits and what might mediate these. All right, so we might think about whether the understanding the mechanisms that are mediating those costs and benefits can help us to design conservation band-aids, so interventions to actually do something about the climate change problem. So let's start with Thermal Physiology 101. So on the slide here, we need to begin with discussing a fundamental pattern that seems to be true of all taxa. And that's that maintaining a safe body temperature is fundamental for survival. Okay. So on the slide, we have a thermal performance curve, which is something we often think about with ectotherms, like this lizard on the slide, but which exist in birds and mammals as well. And the main point here is that all animals have this small optimum range of active body temperatures on the x-axis, over which their physiological performance, which is on the y-axis, is maintained. And performance can be any component of your capacity to do stuff. It could be how fast you run. It could be how efficiently you assimilate food into your body. Any component of what makes you function well as an organism is on that y-axis. And all of that is tightly constrained by body temperature in this really non-linear way. So you have an optimum body temperature range over which your performance is maximized, which you're doing best at being the kind of organism that you are. But if your body temperature rises too high, you're likely to lose performance more rapidly than if your body temperature slides too low. So you get this asymmetry in the thermal performance curve. And that feature of animal physiology has led to this drop-off in performance at the hot end being called the thermal cliff. The important thing here is that the consequences of falling off that thermal cliff are really extreme. If you allow your performance, your body temperature to rise too high and your performance to go to zero, the consequence of that is fatal. So these photographs here are from heat wave events that have occurred in Australia over the past decade. which have caused mass mortalities of flying foxes, these bats in the top picture, and Carnaby's black cockatoos, which are the birds in the bottom picture there, because air temperatures got to the point where the animals were unable to defend their body temperature within that safe range anymore, and they slid off the thermal cliff. So given that the consequences of falling off that thermal cliff are really severe, animals should be working hard to keep their body temperatures within that safe range. So the difference between a lizard like an ectotherm and an ectotherm like a lizard, and an endotherm like a bird or a mammal, is that endotherms have this physiological superpower, which allows us to maintain our stable body temperature using adjustments in our metabolic rates, which we can see on the graph here, and also in our evaporative cooling rates. So in this graph, we've got environmental temperature on the x-axis. So that's the temperature that you're exposed to in your environment. And on the y-axis, we've got the typical response of an endotherm, like a bird, like the white-browed sparrow weaver on the slide, in response to changing environmental temperatures. So all endotherms, all birds, all humans, all mammals have this range of environmental temperatures called the thermoneutral zone, during which the energetic costs, the metabolic costs of maintaining that safe body temperature are minimized. Below that, we need to increase our metabolism and increase our energy expenditure by shivering to raise our body temperatures. And above that, we start to use mechanisms like evaporative cooling to start to bring those body temperatures down. So at either end, we have this increase in metabolic rates, which is associated with having to do something to maintain a stable body temperature. And that increased metabolism burns energy and creates heat. So you get this counterproductive creation of heat in order to lose heat at the hot end. Okay, and then as your environmental temperatures approach and start to exceed your body temperature, the only way that it's physically possible to lose heat to the environment at that point is to start to evaporate water. And so we get these strong nonlinear relationships between environmental temperature and the rate of water loss from an organism, which is associated with the organism actually using that water loss in order to keep cool. All right, so we do this by sweating, birds do it by panting. Okay, so let's try and move these concepts into the field. So in the real world, your heat load comes from the temperature of the environment that you're exposed to, plus your own metabolic heat production. So the environmental temperature, which people also call operative temperature, is a combination of microclimate conditions. It's not just about the temperature of the air. So in this picture here, we can see that a bird that's sitting on a branch in a tree in the Kalahari desert is experiencing an operative environmental temperature that's associated not just with the temperature of the air, but also with the wind that it's exposed to, the solar radiation it's exposed to, humidity, re-radiation from the ground, and so on. So that means that the temperature that a bird experiences on a 30-degree day, for example, depends a lot on where it is due to fine-scale variation in these factors. Okay, so for example, a bird that's sitting on a branch in the tree that's nicely exposed to a nice cool breeze and has shade from the canopy above is going to be experiencing a cooler operative environmental temperature than the same bird would if it was standing on the ground in the sun at the same moment on the same day. Okay, so these two images here can give us a kind of a visual indication of what this looks like. They're taken at the same time on the same day, but with a normal camera at the top and a thermal imaging camera at the bottom, so that you can see the whole range of different thermal environments that are available in one moment in a landscape. And if we think about trying to combine that with what we saw before about the underlying physiology of a bird, we can start to see how birds and other animals can actually use those thermal landscapes to manage the heat load they're exposed to. So here's our white-browed sparrow weaver again, and these data in the graph are actually drawn from actual real white-browed sparrow weavers. So we've got operative environmental temperature on the x-axis, the metabolic rate on the y-axis, that's the red line, and also evaporative water loss, which is the blue dashed line. All right, so if we imagine that our sparrow weaver is standing in the shade on the ground on this 37-degree day in the Kalahari, it's experiencing an environmental temperature of 46 degrees. And that maps to a metabolic rate that it's needing to use to keep cool, that's somewhere about here, and evaporative water loss rate somewhere around here. If the bird was to move into the shade in the branches of the tree, it's experiencing a cooler temperature of 41 degrees. And that's going to shift its energetic costs down to here, and its water loss costs down as well. So you can see that just by moving around in the landscape, this bird can manage the costs that it's paying to maintain that really important, safe, optimum body temperature. All right. So these behavioral changes for keeping cool are really ubiquitous among animals around the world. And some of the three most visible behaviors that we see birds undertaking are seeking shade, like I showed you on the previous slide, but also reducing activity, because reducing activity is reducing the metabolic thermal load. So the heat that you're actually producing by running around. If you stop running around, you can reduce that heat production, and that helps you to maintain that safe body temperature once again. So these two behaviors reduce thermal load. But birds will also engage in increased panting as air temperatures increase, and that's because, unlike us, they don't have sweat glands, so birds have to evaporate water somehow, and they do it by panting. Okay, so these three graphs are real data from sociable weavers that we collected in the Kalahari Desert. But the three behaviors, they're very effective for maintaining a safe body temperature, but they don't come for free. Each of these has consequences, it has associated costs. So, for example, if you're increasing your panting rate to increase your evaporative cooling, you're also risking dehydration by dumping too much water. But all three behaviors carry with them missed opportunities. So all three of these things can prevent you from doing something else that you probably should be doing instead. Okay. So in the context of research on the potential for behavioral thermoregulation to buffer climate change impacts, these opportunity costs are often underestimated or overlooked altogether, but they can be really important. So they're occurring when animals are trading off those behaviors that are promoting thermoregulation against behaviors that are promoting survival or reproduction. And understanding and documenting the costs and consequences of behavioral thermoregulation has been a really core theme of our project for the last 15 years. And it's one we're still actively working on with projects on multiple species ongoing. We also have existing data on aspects of this for quite a wide range of species, and here are some of them. So we can have a quick look at where we're at in our understanding of this. So one of the most common patterns that we find across species is that as temperature rises, foraging intake declines. Measured through effort or efficiency or success, foraging is declining. So this is occurring across the arid-zone bird species we've studied, such as the white-browed sparrow weaver, fork-tailed drongo, southern yellow-billed hornbill, pied babbler, but it's also occurring in mountain species like the Cape rock jumper and urban species like the red-winged starling at the top left of the slide. And we've found that these ubiquitous declines in foraging intake are often mediated by behavioral thermoregulatory trade-offs. So, for example, in common fiscals, which is a widespread shrike species across Africa that many of you will be familiar with, if they seek shaded perches, which is the box on the left of this graph, they're also reducing their prey capture rates significantly per minute, halving it, in fact. And in many ground foraging species like yellow-billed hornbills, pied babblers, white-browed sparrow weavers, there also seems to be a trade-off between panting and foraging, such that when the birds are trying to hold the beak open to pant, at the same time as continuing to try to forage, they're suffering declines in intake rates in terms of the numbers of prey items or the biomass that they're taking in, and foraging intensity, which is presumably happening because it's really difficult to pick up and handle food while also panting. And in species where we've been able to measure this loss of foraging intake often has consequences for body mass. For example, on the left, you can see one of our study southern yellow-billed hornbills sitting on a perch scale at his nest box where his weight is measured. And on the right-hand side, we have a habituated southern pied babbler from the Cunningham River Reserve study population in the Kalahari, where it's weighing itself on a top pan balance. And so using data collected from birds like these, we can see that as daily temperature increases, the daily body mass change, so that's the amount of body mass these birds can put on between dawn and dusk, is declining. Okay, so on very hot days, the birds are actually starting to lose body mass during that day period between dawn and dusk. And if you start to think about the increasing frequency and intensity and length of heat waves that we're experiencing in these arid environments globally, you can see how this is going to become a conservation concern, because the ability of these birds to maintain body mass is being compromised by exposure to chronic heat. So another almost ubiquitous pattern in our data so far is that reduced foraging success during hot periods is correlating with reduced provisioning rates to nests in breeding birds. So here are a few examples of species in which high temperatures reduce foraging intake, which then in turn reduces provisioning rate on the y-axis of these graphs. And in our systems, this almost always correlates with smaller, lighter nestlings that grow less and fledge at much reduced body sizes. So across the nestling period, cumulative numbers of hot days can also make nestlings less likely to fledge at all, either due to increased risk by starvation or dehydration in the nests, or to increase predation risk. For example, in the rock jumpers and the shrikes, this slowdown in nestling mass gain means that the chicks are taking longer to fledge. And the more days that they spend in the nest, the more likely it is that a predator is going to find that nest. And so we see reduced survival through to predation risk as well. Okay, so it's a little bit bleak, but maybe these behavior data can actually help us design some conservation band-aids for climate change. And I'm just going to take a look at the example of the southern yellow-billed hornbill where we've tried to do this. So this species is one in which the effects of high temperatures on foraging, on body mass maintenance, on reproduction appear to be particularly strong. So in our 10-year data set, we find that the proportion of days during summer that are above 35 degrees Celsius, that's the x-axis here, is strongly correlated with breeding success in our study birds. And those days are increasing in frequency as climate change progresses. And so what we've seen over the last decade is that the number of nest boxes in our study population that are being used year on year is declining, and the number of those nests that are successfully fledging at least one chick is declining as well. So this is a population really in need of a conservation band-aid to assist with climate change resilience. If there was anything that we could do to help tide these birds through, that would be worth investigating. All right. So one big question here is to what extent these losses of nestling quality, nest mass gain, and nest success are being driven by adults passing on those foraging costs they're experiencing to their offspring by reducing their provisioning rates to the nest. And to what extent are these temperature effects actually down to direct costs of high temperatures on the nestlings themselves, driven by changes in nest temperature? For example, water and energy costs of thermoregulation or performance costs associated with hypothermia. So if we have enough data, we can investigate these kinds of questions using path models, or what we call piecewise structural equation modeling. That's what we're seeing on the slide here. This is an example from my PhD student, Tanya van der Ven's work with the yellow-billed hornbills. And what she was able to show is that 70% of the temperature-driven variation in nestling mass gain was driven by direct temperature effects in the study system, so mediated by that nest box temperature, and 30% via the temperature-related reductions in provisioning rate. So when we looked at this system and started thinking, well, what can we do as a conservation intervention for these birds? Tanya's analysis here made it clear to us that the place to target the intervention was around that nest temperature problem. Point being that if we know where the majority of the problem lies, we're better placed to help. And so we tried to put a conservation band-aid here using some funding that we got from WWF USA. And that band-aid was tailored to where we thought it could be most effective, which was trying to buffer nest temperatures. So this is work that Obikeng Pule on the slide there did for his MSc project. And he designed a nest box for these hornbills that was thermally buffered by adding these insulation panels around the outside of it. So the box that's that's wired to the tree there has a double layer all the way around, with those outside panels essentially shading the box inside. And Obi was able to show that his insulated boxes were significantly cooler than uninsulated normal nests in this environment, and that they were staying below around 50 degrees, which is that dashed line there, which we know from physiology work is the lethal tolerance limit for yellow-billed hornbills. So these insulated boxes were staying below those lethal limits far more than the uninsulated ones. And furthermore, Obi conducted an experiment where he offered half the birds in the study population this kind of new box, and showed that the probability of nest success in the insulated boxes is considerably higher than in the uninsulated boxes. So that's the data on the right, this graph. And furthermore, that in the insulated boxes, that relationship between air temperature during the nesting period and the mass of the chicks was completely buffered. So in his control boxes, the usual nests that the birds were using, we see the strong negative relationship between air temperature during the nesting period and the mass of the chicks, and that's directly correlated to that probability of nesting success. But the insulated boxes, we've managed to remove that temperature effect altogether. So that was a great success. So another thing that we've been looking at is what else might buffer impacts of opportunity costs of high temperatures on fitness of birds. So if we think about behavioral buffering, the idea that you might be able to use the thermal landscape to stay cool and thereby reduce your physiological costs, we can see it's not a silver bullet, right? Because we can see that opportunity costs are common. They take the form of lost opportunities to forage, to provision your chicks. However, your vulnerability to climate change, it might be partly defined by the severity of these opportunity costs, which brought forward for us this question of whether habitat features or species traits could shape those consequences of behavioral buffering. For example, could behavioral flexibility allow birds to manage the sort of size of the opportunity cost that they're exposed to when they shift around in the landscape to manage heat load? What about sociality? This was an interesting question for us because birds that live in social groups can help each other to manage other costs in the environment. For example, in these three social species here, there's often a single group member at any one time that's responsible for vigilance for the whole group so that other group members can get on with foraging. Could they be able to load lighten in a similar way to help themselves manage thermal costs? And what about habitat features or resource availability? So let's have a look at the habitat features bit, because we don't have a lot of time, and maybe if we can, a little bit of a look at behavioral flexibility as well. In terms of habitat features, we decided to use the white-browed sparrow weavers in the southern Kalahari to have a look at the impact of shade availability. So shade is one type of habitat feature that can vary across the home ranges of different individuals within species, especially in savanna environments where you've got this very patchy habitat with isolated trees and bushes in a grassland. And so shade could be a potentially important resource for buffering the costs of keeping cool, so long as using the shade doesn't entail its own trade-offs in itself. So we investigated this with white-browed sparrow weavers. These birds live in groups of about 2 to 12, and they build really obvious nests in colony trees in the center of a group home range. They are very site faithful. They tend to stay within about a 200-meter radius around their colony. So my master's student, Jamie White, studied 15 colonies of these birds at a field site in the Kalahari. The colonies varied in the amount of shade that they had available in that tight 200-meter radius. We've got 2 satellite photos here, for example, showing a well-shaded group at the top and a very poorly shaded group at the bottom with the colony tree right in the middle. So Jamie looked at the thermoregulatory behaviours and the shade seeking and panting, and also looked at foraging behaviour in relation to the interaction between air temperature, how hot it was on the day, and the shade availability in the bird's home range. And she found that birds that have more access to shade, which is the dark blue line on this graph, use that shade earlier at lower air temperatures than birds with less access to the shade, which is the light blue line. She also found that birds with more shade started panting later at higher air temperatures than birds with less shade. And she showed that foraging rates decline with air temperature, but more steeply for those birds with less access to shade. So overall, the birds in the shadier home ranges were spending less time foraging and more time doing other things, and that might be related to the fact that their panting behaviour was buffered, so they're starting panting later. And that matters because Jamie also found that in the sparrow weavers, there is this trade-off between panting and foraging intensity, and therefore potentially food intake rate in this species. So when a sparrow weaver is panting, its food intake rate is lower than when it isn't. And that's because of that trade-off between trying to use your beak to pant and trying to use it to pick up food. It's very straightforward. But there's no trade-off in this species between foraging in the sun and foraging in the shade and how much food intake you get per unit time under those circumstances. So the birds with access to shade had less requirement to pant. They were panting later. That was enabling them to take in more food at a faster rate, which was allowing them to forage less overall. And we found a similar story in another FitzPatrick cooperative breeder in the same environment, the southern pied babbler. So these data were collected by Amanda Bourne, my PhD student on the slide there. And she worked with 47 birds, collected more than 800 behaviour observations, and found that on hot days when air temperatures were higher than 35 degrees, her babblers had the highest foraging success in locations on the ground. So that's biomass intake on the y-axis, on ground locations, regardless of whether they were in the shade or in the sun. She also found that operative temperatures measured using black bulb thermometers, so they're integrating solar radiation, the wind speed, all of those other factors I showed you on the earlier slide. Operative temperatures in those shaded locations on the ground remained moderate, whereas those in the sun would skyrocket well into the high 40s and even up into the low 50s. So babblers, like sparrow weavers, suffer a trade-off between panting and foraging, and they're spending less than 50% of their time panting, more than 50% of their time panting on days above 35 degrees. So anything that could buffer panting for these birds could make a difference to their ability to maintain foraging intake in the heat. So if we look at these behaviour data together with the temperature data, we can see there's kind of a sweet spot on the ground in the shade for these birds, where they might be able to retreat from those extremely high operative temperatures, reduce the amount of time they spend panting, and maintain foraging intake. And indeed, what Amanda was able to show is that birds that lived in home ranges that had a higher availability of shade on the ground were more able to maintain a good body mass or even put on weight over the course of hot summers versus birds that had little availability of shade on the ground and were losing mass over those time periods. So these kinds of data give us some ideas about what we need to do in order to manage natural ecosystems under climate change, in terms of thinking about what we need to preserve in those environments. In this case, making sure that we're not losing shade cover from savanna habitats for species like southern pied babblers and white-browed sparrow weavers. So resources other than the shade might also have a role to play in buffering trade-offs between thermoregulation and foraging in hot weather. And we've been looking at this a little bit in urban environments. So this is some work by our PhD student, Michaela Stoffberg, who worked with the urban red-winged starlings on the University of Cape Town campus. And you can see that these birds are also trained to land on scales in order for a small food reward so that we can keep track of their body mass change. So Michaela found that just like birds in natural habitats, as temperatures rise, the proportion of time the birds are spending foraging is declining. So they're just like almost every other species we look at, they're showing this decline in foraging as temperatures increase. However, our master's student, Leslie Bayanza, has found that this is only associated with a decline in body mass between dawn and dusk on the weekend or during vacation on the university campus. In the weekdays and term time, this relationship, this decline in foraging as air temperatures rise, doesn't seem to be causing the birds to lose body mass during the week. And these data suggest potentially that the high abundance of really high calorie anthropogenic food, chips and muffins and things that our students discard associated with high human presence on weekdays might buffer thermoregulatory trade-offs in these birds because they're able to get a lot of calories on board really fast during cooler periods of the day. That has interesting implications for interactive effects between urbanization and climate change, especially in climates that are already warm. Okay, so we've looked at how habitat and resource availability might buffer the opportunity costs associated with behavioral thermoregulation. But what about behavioral adjustments by the birds themselves? So could further behavioral flexibility compensate for costly opportunity costs of thermoregulation during hot periods? So we studied this question in fork-tailed drongos in the Kalahari because this species appears to have this remarkable resilience in nestling growth despite high temperatures. And this is in contrast to almost all of the other species we've studied to date. So here's a graph of nestling size at the end of the nesting period on the y-axis against temperature on the x-axis, showing absolutely no relationship at all. So you've got mass in the left-hand graph, you've got the size of the legs, tarsus length in the right-hand graph. But like all the other species that we've studied, the provisioning rates of parent drongos decline with increasing air temperature. So there's a bit of a mystery here on how they're preventing the impacts of this on their chicks. And it turns out that they do this through compensatory behavioral adjustments, especially on hot mornings, which they must know presage hot days. So on hot mornings, they will increase their provisioning efforts to the extent that there is no overall decline in provisioning rate on the day scale as the weather heats up. But the other thing that matters is what the drongos are doing with their time on hot afternoons when they're not provisioning. So my student Ben, who's in the picture on the slide there, found that instead of provisioning, they're spending increasing amounts of time shading the chicks in the nest and keeping the sun off them. So the proportion of time they spend doing this increases as air temperature increases, as does the length of time they spend during each bout of nest shading. And the birds are managing to keep the nest significantly cooler when they shade. So if we go back to this path model of the potential impacts of air temperature on nestling mass gain and nest success via provisioning rates and via nest temperature, we can see that the drongos are putting a band-aid on their declining provisioning rate on hot days by preemptively increasing the amount of food they're shoving into those chicks in the morning on days that they can tell are going to be really hot. And they're also putting a band-aid on the nest temperature pathway by spending the time that they're not provisioning on hot afternoons shading their chicks instead. So by using behavioral flexibility, drongos are buffering both of these pathways and successfully maintaining chick growth during heat waves. Okay, so we need to wrap up quite soon, but just before we do, I want to spend the last few moments I have talking about the implications of everything we've just been telling you about for ecosystem function. So this is a fairly new idea that we're still developing, and it relies on the concept that the landscape of heat, that's this thermal landscape that birds are responding to, involving all of those trade-offs we've just been talking about between foraging and thermoregulation, depending on where you are and what you're doing, that landscape of heat might be analogous to the landscape of fear. So the landscape of fear concept is this idea that animals shift their behavior in space and in time in response to perceived predation risk, and that these shifts in behavior have consequences for species interactions and for ecosystem function. So that means that predation shapes ecosystem function via changes in animal behavior and not just via those direct consumptive interactions, not just via killing animals and taking them out of the system. So not just via changes in relative abundance. Okay, so the classic example of the landscape of fear is this very famous example of what happened in Yellowstone National Park when wolves were reintroduced into that system. So wolves were missing from Yellowstone for an extended period of time and were returned as part of a conservation program. And fear of wolves caused a change in behavior of the large ungulates in that ecosystem, who moved away from some foraging locations where they felt more vulnerable to the wolves and into others where they felt more buffered from that predator. And that triggered trophic cascades that changed the vegetation structure with wide-ranging impacts that even included improvements in freshwater ecosystem health through improvements in vegetation structure on the stream banks. So the Yellowstone study is correlative, and it's been controversial because of that. But trophic cascade effects that are triggered by the landscape of fear alone have been experimentally demonstrated in other less famous systems as well. For example, this Surichi study on the slide was all about how to change raccoon behavior by playback of predator calls. Okay. So how is the landscape of heat analogous to the landscape of fear? Well, the landscape of heat, like the landscape of fear, has both spatial and temporal components. So animals are shifting their activity in relation to the risk of lethal dehydration and hypothermia, which is analogous to the risk of death by predation in space and in time. And different species will respond in different ways. So for some species, those shifts will occur at cooler temperatures than for other species. And in some circumstances, for example, in the pied babblers, we find that as temperatures rise, heat actually becomes a more powerful driver of behavior than anything else, even than predation risk. Okay. So if our different species are responding in different ways, this could decouple species interactions and create new ones, which could result in trophic cascades. So here's a quick and charismatic example that was documented by Robin Heatham and Andrea Fuller at Wits University. They showed that cheetahs were changing their activity and hunting patterns during periods of hot weather, which could bring them into contact with different types of prey. So here is the activity pattern of cheetahs that were wearing transmitters around their necks, showing their activity during cool, dry periods in the graph on the left, and their hunting patterns in the graph on the right. But during heat waves, during hot periods, we see that the activity of the cheetahs is shifting very strongly into those dawn and dusk periods and away from the heat of the day, the middle of the day. And so too are their hunting patterns, shifting into the dawn and into the dusk. So that has the potential, at least, to bring them into contact with more nocturnal prey. And that could change the balance of species interactions in the community as hot weather, like the bottom part of this slide, becomes more and more the norm, and cheetahs are targeting crepuscular and nocturnal rather than diurnal prey species more and more often. Okay, so these ecosystem impacts of behavioral changes for thermoregulation are a new frontier for ecological research, and there are few studies that yet tackle this. However, behavioral changes can fundamentally shift ecosystems, even in the absence of catastrophic population reductions or range shifts of animals. And we know that this is the case because of the landscape of fear. Therefore, it isn't far-fetched to think that this could happen because of animals changing responses to the landscape of heat as well. So to conclude, 15 years of Hotbird's research project work has given us important insights, both into issues that can inform applied conservation and also into the theory of behavioral ecology. For example, we know that animals use behavioral buffering to manage heat loads and manage immediately thermal risk, but that this can come with consequences associated with opportunity costs, missed opportunities to forage, for example, and that these carry impacts that affect fitness, affecting body mass maintenance, they're affecting breeding success. So vulnerability to climate change might be shaped by the severity of these costs, and there are habitat factors and intrinsic features of species that might be able to buffer these under some circumstances. So a careful collection of behavior data can help us design targeted conservation band-aids for species and for communities of wildlife as well. And then these behavioral changes for thermoregulation can have broader implications too. We can use concepts from the landscape of fear to help us think about what the implications of changing landscapes of heat might be as heat waves become more frequent and as mean temperatures rise. So we can build and test hypotheses about the impacts of this on ecosystem functioning using the landscape of fear framework and translating it across to landscapes of heat. But we still need empirical data to inform these ideas and also to inform conservation at species and at ecosystem levels, because animal behavior is shaping climate change responses at both of these levels. So we're not done yet. We know a lot more than we did 15 years ago, but I would say that there's a lot more work to be done. But the data we have now are starting to open new doors for conservation interventions that work, and for our understanding of how not just species might respond to climate change, but how entire ecosystems might respond. So thanks very much indeed for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take any questions or thoughts that you might have and just to discuss any of these ideas. Thank you.